In 2018, anime production studio Studio Dean, with co-producer Crunchyroll, released an anthology horror series titled The Junji Ito Collection. The anime adapts and follows the original stories from the source material. However, as an adaptation, it's not particularly good. The show has animation that looks stiff and flat, with the whole show feeling more like a tracing of Ito's work than a proper adaptation, really only creating the basic outline of Ito's work without really understanding the meaning and adaptating the mechanics behind them in a better way suited for the animation medium. If you're interested in learning more, I highly recommend checking out Super Eye Patch's Wolf video about the entire series. While the series has an outside appearance of being a faithful adaptation of Ito's work, it lacked in other facets that, when mastered and strengthened, culminate into a great adaptation that can stand on its own 2 feet. Before we get too far into it, I feel like I should clarify what I mean and the characteristics of a good adaptation. I think a good team knows that there are certain elements that go into adaptating that's easier said than done, including honoring the essence of the source material, balancing the needs of old and new audiences with the demand of the medium at hand, and even avoiding over-expanding or underserving the narrative. When it comes to manga specifically, experienced teams and directors know not to just create a one-for-one from the original source, but focusing on the added value that they can offer that comes with the animation medium. Juggling things like color direction, camera movement, music, and sound design, while also knowing what elements to tweak and or cut away from the original source, and can only work in a manga medium and supplementing them with what works best in film and animation. The goal being for the animation and film medium to enhance the story, and this is super essential to what I think goes into what makes a successful and engaging adaptation. With AdultSwim's adaptation of Junji Ito's manga Uzumaki finally being released after 5 years from its initial public announcement, I want to take a deeper look and see if it holds up and works well as a good adaptation. Part 1. Junji Ito's magnum opus. A quick little introduction for those who may not be aware, Ito Junji is a horror mangaka. From a very young age, Ito developed a fascination with horror from manga and films and began creating his own comics during his early years. After working initially as a dental technician, he ended up shifting to full-time manga creation, with his mid-80s manga Tomie really starting to take off of his career. In the late 90s, Ito sat down and began creating what a lot of his fans consider his magnum opus, Uzumaki, an eldritch horror story about a small Japanese town plagued by supernatural curse around spirals. Uzumaki began from Ito's desire to explore transformations in people's living in the traditional Japanese warehouses, heaving a lot of inspiration from his own childhood experiences, as well as being inspired by the spiral shape of a mosquito coil, which makes its own twisted interpolation in the manga. Ito heavily aimed to subvert the portrayal of spirals in media by transforming them into a more eldritch horror element. Ito found spirals to be both unsettling and symbolic, while drawing influence from racist piece of shit novelist H.P. Lovecraft and his atmospheric storytelling. Uzumaki was published in the seinen manga magazine Shogakukan from January 19, 1998 to August 30, 1999. Later going on to be published in an omnibus volume for later publications. Uzumaki was obviously a big success, which leads us to the Uzumaki adaptation we came to talk about today. Part 2, the 2000 Uzumaki film that no one talks about. Sorry for the series edging I'm doing, but before getting to AdultSwim's adaptation of the manga series, I thought it'd be cool to look at and quickly talk about the manga's first adaptation, going over what worked with it and what didn't work in that adaptation. Also, I find it funny that even though this film has been around for over 20 years, I hardly see anyone online ever talk about it. If you don't care, you just want to skip to the AdultSwim adaptation, just go to this timestamp right here. Film director Akihiro Higuchi's 2000 film adaptation of Uzumaki was actually the manga's first adaptation. Director Akihiro Higuchi made his future debut with Uzumaki under the alias of Higuchinsky. Higuchinsky desired to be as faithful to the manga as possible. However, at the time, the manga had not actually been completed. This being the case, the film follows the first few beats of the manga as guideline, while briefly adding in short sequences from other parts of the manga before branching out off into doing its own thing, creating its own specific ending. Higuchi had a difficult task of condensing this manga and its wide range of stories into a more easy to follow and digestible narrative film. While people would infer that that automatically makes this adaptation weak because it doesn't follow the story plot one for one, I say otherwise. Uzumaki's story is pretty dense with a lot of plot threads, characters, and expansiveness. When properly adapting a story, you need to know the best aspects to take and what to leave on the cutting room floor, especially in the film medium when you have only so much time to tell a narrative story. So I don't really fault the creators of the film for exploring the original narrative in different ways. While I don't consider the movie a bad adaptation on the story front, where I do think it fails as the adaptation is in its tone and atmosphere. In the original manga, Ito uses the black and white and its high contrast as a sense of foreboding, adding to the atmosphere. The 2000 film is definitely a product of its time with the overindulgence of the green tinge, obviously inspired from a little indie movie you might have heard of called The Matrix. I don't know. Also, the inclusion of fast, bold flash cuts and other quirky editing choices that Japanese filmmakers were experimenting with at the time don't actually aid in creating the needed atmosphere for the adaptation of this story. All of this culminates in a film that feels so tonally inconsistent, coming across more as comedic and cartoony and failing to be effective in creating the deep stirrings and dread that are fostered in the original manga. While Akihiro Higuchi's 2000 film adaptation does try to have its own style akin to the filmmaking techniques and trends of the time, while streamlining the story to fit into a traditional film length, the film hasn't aged amazingly well. While translating some imagery from the original manga into the movie is great, tonally, it isn't. Removing essential elements of the manga's tone and atmosphere leaves behind a tonally shifting film that only makes you want to strictly just read the manga. I think it falls a little short of reaching the goal of enhancing the original story. I don't think this is a bad movie necessarily, but looking at it through the lens of an adaptation, it definitely leaves a little more to be desired. I suggest checking it out if you haven't seen it before and you're interested. But now let's dive in and analyze the trickiness of Adult Swim's adaptation. Part 3. Adult Swim's descent into the spiral. What's instantly noticeable about Adult Swim's Uzumaki adaptation is its strict adherence to the visual look of the original manga, which other adaptations of Ito's work haven't quite done to this degree. Art directors Sato Takashi and Oda Arie have paid close attention to translating Ito's pen work, brushstrokes, and cross-hatching into the animation. The amount of detail in the animation and close-ups are incredibly innate, using shadows and tones to give the animation more texture and depth, which pays off in the more purposeful scares. Let's look at the scene of Azami removing her hat. Look at the small details of Azami's eyes still glistening and the subtle tilt of her head, adding tiny movements to her pose that aren't easily noticeable in the manga. The small twitch in her eye, leading her eye to start slowly swirling inward, getting faster and faster before sputtering radically and disappearing like water down a basin. With the addition of minimal but effective sound design, this is the enhancement I was talking about. There is a mixed use of 2D and 3D animation. While there are still reservations about 3D work in anime, Hiroshi Nagahama and the rest of the team try to use it in a tasteful manner, one that's not overly distracting. The team is still able to maintain Ito's visual style and look in these 3D movements, imposing it on the 3D character models akin to the comic book style applied to the 3D models in the Spider-Verse movies. The Uzumaki team has had over 5 years to work on this, with several delays and postponements, but their hard work speaks for itself, with the show looking amazing in the first episode. Okay, I'm going to proceed with the next part very cautiously because I feel so deeply about it. It's obvious that a lot of work was put into the miniseries as a whole, but unfortunately, I think the animation is at its best in its first episode, whose consistency isn't perfectly carried through the rest of the series. The 3D animation becomes overly noticeable and distracting to me in the remaining episodes, something very akin to 2016's Berserk.
Screw you guys!
Sorry, Berserk fans, I'm sorry. Given the animation and uncanny valley aspect that the creators aren't going for in the show, while there are still good elements of good animation in other episodes, overall, it doesn't feel as polished as the first episode, leaving the show looking like a majority of its budget was incorporated into that one first episode. With a surplus of slow and stiff animation, weird walking animation, and the use of fucking tracking movements of a PG on a background that anyone who understands the basic of Adobe Premiere can replicate, the series is sort of a mess and fails to keep a consistent animation output, which is incredibly disheartening. If you think I'm being unfair or I'm making a big deal, just look at this. While Twitter isn't the most reliable source of information, it's useful in this situation to see how other people watching the show were reacting to it. There's a discernible change in the audience's viewpoint after episode 1, with people basically dogpiling on the downward spiral in quality after that. And while I would say people arguing and complaining online should usually be disregarded or taken with the smallest grains of salt, the community's comments on the quality of the show were hard to ignore and had some truth to them. It's pretty hard to ignore the immense change in quality between episodes 1 and 2, going from detailed and smooth animation like this to something lacking detail with borderline hilarious animation you can't ignore like this. Director Hiroshi Nagahama is not credited as director after episode 1. He's been replaced by Yuji Murahama. This is different from the episode director role, so from episode 2 onward, Nagahama is only credited for storyboards and 3D character design. Nagahama is credited as the storyboard artist, animation director, and key animator on episode 1 and 4, I believe, with Fugaku being the animation production studio. In episodes 2 and 3, Nagahama is still credited with the storyboards, but not with animation. I believe that there needed to be more attention given to the team of animators, as well as a proper budget and time to produce a good, consistent piece of work, or you end up with people on Twitter dragging the entire project. I want to clarify that this also does not give anyone the right to harass the Uzumaki animators team online. That type of mindset and action are completely pathetic and deplorable, and anyone who thinks otherwise can kindly go fuck off. I don't find pleasure in bashing animation studios or animators because I know the medium of animation is extremely hard, and I don't find that action particularly helpful or constructive. However, constructive criticism in good faith is perfectly okay, but I do think there should be a baseline of consistency when working on a project between studios and animators to keep a consistent tone and level of work. While this animation does fall short in cohesive animation, the team does do a good job incorporating a good voice cast and sound design. While I never felt they were something to completely write home about, I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention it. The sound design works best in its more subtle applications. An example that really crawled under my skin was the slight eye-twitching sound in the zombie's eye scene in episode 1. As someone who is quite squeamish about eyes, the amazing animation and subtle but effective sound design left a visceral effect on me. The show doesn't just suffer from an animation drop-off, it suffers from a lot of pacing issues. A lot was riding on episode 1 with setting up the story, introducing us to the world and its main characters, while setting up future plot points for the rest of the series. While not a perfect specimen of narrative pacing, Episode 1 provides us with a clear story structure, some character development, a good balance of horror and reflection, efficient exposition, and pretty good escalation and foreshadowing. A lot happens in episode 1, but it feels relatively easy to follow without being completely lost, leaving the audience looking forward to the progression of the story and the atmosphere the team has worked hard to build. In episode 2, the narrative pacing moves quickly and erratically, with Kiri appearing increasingly detached from the bizarre and extremely disturbing events happening around her. For new audiences who aren't attached to the manga and have extra context from it, I'm sure this disconnection also forms within them. They may become unable to care about the grotesque events due to new characters being introduced and then disappearing or dying within minutes before any real attachment can actually be established. Episode 2 just rushes through 5 chapters without proper build-up and pacing. Classmates turn into snails, a moment that could be a chance at adapting, and by adding more grotesque and slimy bits of body horror, falls slightly kind of flat as peers reacting differently, as I did. While there is some good animation in Kiri's hair transformation, the execution of it feels so disjointed that it culminates in a sentient hair battle with a classmate who hasn't been on screen long enough for me to actually remember her name. This episode's focus seemed to be on moving quickly to the next spiral-shaped event instead of incorporating supplemental scenes that actually get us to care about these characters. In order for the horror and the atmosphere of the story to really be effective and hit even harder. This pacing trend also unfortunately continues in episodes 3 and 4, with things moving so fast all atmosphere is lost and the plot becomes almost laughable. The events from mosquito women in a hospital to mushroom umbilical cords to the fire and the killing to typhoon and the monster in the house next door all squeezed into 26 minutes gave me so much whiplash I started laughing at how fast the show was breezing through the story beats, almost losing all horror factor for me. While a lot of these chapters in the original manga sometimes just ended with little to no resolution, in this adaptation that little to no resolution somehow sticks out even more, with things feeling like creepy spiral shit happening and then ending as fast as they came. This could have been a chance for the team to take some artistic liberty to find better and more seamless resolutions to weave these stories together and end them better. Like, like why is the like Like, why is the Jack in the Box kid making an appearance in episode 3 in the middle of a fucking typhoon? I read the manga, so I know how he originally starts bouncing around again, but this inclusion in the episode feels pointless and tacked on in like the last 30 seconds of it. Like, why is this narratively happening now? Did the typhoon dig up his body from the burial site? Is that what happened? It it comes across as a team saying, well, the fans like the Jack in the Box kid. We gotta include him somewhere. Does it make sense to add him here? In the middle of a fucking typhoon? No? Well, fuck it. Let's include him here anyway so the fans don't get mad we left him out. It, it makes no sense. You should know what to keep in an adaptation, what to trim for better narrative flow and experience. After watching episode 4, being delivered a mixed bag of animation, steadfast pacing, and a fast wrap of the series, I just had to sit there for a while. I had to sit and ponder a question that's been stirring since episode 2. Is this adaptation horrible? Part 4. Is Adult Swim's Uzumaki adaptation horrible? Short answer, no. I don't plan to delve too far into what I think could have been better, as I think that just disconnects us from the actual piece and being able to interact with it and analyze it in good faith. When it comes to Adult Swim's adaptation, I had so many hopes for it. Throughout the setbacks and postponements, I trusted the team and trusted that they were taking their time with the production and giving it the best that they possibly could. While animation is not easy and their hard work shows up in nuggets throughout the series, the very inconsistent and subpar animation is a disappointment that treads closer to the 2018 Junji Ito collection than apart. Junji Ito's manga Uzumaki, while a great manga, is not entirely perfect. The manga also has some clunky pacing issues, but flows smoother due to its medium and no apparent time limit or rush to check off story beats for the sake of it. While this adaptation does follow the story closely, it lacks in the areas an adaptation could really stand out from the others in the best of ways. I got the impression that the team just wanted to follow the script one for one without taking any liberties to improve the original source material in their adaptation. Smoothing out the pacing, adding more scenes with characters to actually become attached to them, and removing or changing story beats for the betterment of the entire narrative are examples of choices the team could have made for the betterment of this adaptation. While Adult Swim does attempt some of these aspects, the execution is a pacing mess, with confusing or little to no character development and animation quirks that I'm sure confuse or even turn off newcomers, which inherently I think falls short as an adaptation. Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire came out in 2005 to pretty much a positive consensus from the public from an important turning point in the Harry Potter franchise. Besides the fact of the film's choice not to cut Daniel Radcliffe's hair, leading me to internalize the film as Harry Potter in the year everyone needed a haircut, it's a pretty good movie. Okay, except the complete erasure of Winky the House Elf and Hermione's subplot of creating spew for the campaigning rights of House Elves. For those who don't remember who wanted to be a contrarian so much they never read the Harry Potter books, Winky was a house elf to the Crouch family who would later on, to her disagreement, become a free elf and go on to be employed at Hogwarts. In the grand scheme, Winky is not the most important character. She is not the chosen one, she does not hold any plot twist information or anything like that. Her involvement fleshes out the world building more, as well as adding and further solidifying character development and aspects for Hermione. Yet she is usually favored among the Harry Potter fanbase. But in the film franchise, she doesn't make an appearance, is never mentioned or alluded to, she doesn't exist. While Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire is usually regarded as a faithful one-for-one adaptation, the filmmakers knew as an adaptation and to work within the time restraints of a movie, they would have to put aside components of the novel in order to streamline it to make it more engaging narrative story. The best directors and filmmakers know how to adapt. Not by just following the story beat for beat, but by being experts in realizing what works best in the story and what doesn't, distilling it into a more cohesive and contemporary narrative to follow without components that don't serve the betterment of the story as a whole. This isn't new. Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of The Shining is very far from being a perfect adaptation of Stephen King's original novel, with many aspects of both works differing. However, Kubrick's adaptation is usually considered to be one of the best horror movies and adaptations of all time. But if you were looking for a more faithful one-for-one adaptation, that lies in 1997 Stephen King's The Shining TV miniseries. I'm not going to go too deep into it because Super Eye Patch Wolf has already made a perfect video regarding the topic, and I have nothing new or useful to add to that conversation. My point being, I don't think anyone making the adaptation should feel married to having to follow story beats one for one out of obligation to it or obligation to the fan base. I'm not saying to disregard those important aspects, but they should not be a driving force in the adaptation's creation that a creator needs to feel shackled by. The best teams know how to take best aspects of the source material and improve it for the better. Getting back to the original question I had that started stirring after episode 2, culminating in this entire video, is Adult Swim's Uzumaki adaptation horrible? Short answer, no. However, while a lot of hard work was put into it, I do think this adaptation as a whole suffers from creating a consistent baseline of animation and atmospheric tone while being more concerned with just following story beats without taking the time to remove, add, or strengthen aspects from the original manga for a more impactful and consistent piece of work in horror. I think anyone who is a fan of the manga or curious about it should definitely give it a watch, but I wouldn't consider this a replacement over the original manga and will always recommend reading it if, that's what you're into. I don't think Adult Swim series needed to be the perfect adaptation, but that's okay, because we were already given the perfect adaptation over 25 years ago. And it's right here. Editing me here. Just want to say that's it for me today on Uzumaki. Let me know what you thought about the show. You can find my links in the description if that's what you're into. Letterboxd, Instagram, Spotify, etc. All that fun stuff. Do with it what you will. Like, comment, subscribe if that's your thing, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.